And then when we got the aircraft, within a matter, look, the big putsch against the Egyptians started on the 22nd of December 1948. And the war ended on the 7th of January 1949. The United Nations Security Council said that's the final deadline, 4 p.m. on the 7th of January. The last day of the war was absolutely dramatic. We had moved 101 Squadron down to the Negev to be as close as possible to the army at Khatzor. 2 of our Spitfires were on patrol in the battle zone. They saw that 3 Israeli trucks were burning. They had been attacked by the Egyptian Air Force. But the Egyptian Air Force wasn't in the area when they arrived. Suddenly they see 4 Spitfires flying into the battle area, and our guys attacked, and this guy McElroy, whose name I mentioned, he shot down 2 Spitfires. Another guy shot down 1 Spitfire. And you know, we only had 2 tanks in the war, which were manned by Machelniks because they had tank experience. Actually, 3 tanks were stolen by British defectors when they evacuated the British forces. But 1 broke down on the first day and they didn't have spare parts. So we were left with 2 tanks. And one of those tanks shot down one of the Spitfires. And the commander of the tank, listen to this figure, was a guy by the name of Dan Samuel. And Dan Samuel was a grandson of Lord Samuel, who was the first High Commissioner for the Mandate in Palestine.
Herbert Samuel.
Herbert Samuel.
Yeah.
And Dan Samuel went back to study at Oxford University, and one of the guys in his class was one of the pilots who bailed out, who was shot down on the 7th of January. That's one of the quirks of history. Anyhow, all 4 Spitfires were shot down. The British Air Command, you see, Britain was responsible for the defense of the Suez Canal in their agreement with Egypt. When Yigal Allon broke through into Egypt, they didn't know how far he would go. Would he try to go through the canal? That's why they sent out these, they got permission from the Air Ministry in London to send out a reconnaissance over the battle zone. And those 4 Spitfires were shot down, and the Air Force Command in the canal zone said, what's happened to the Spitfires? Why haven't they come back? So they sent out 19 aircraft, Spitfires and Tempests, to see what happened. At that time, we had 4 Spitfires in the air, and our 4 Spitfires engaged the RAF formation. They shot down one of the Tempests. Asa Weizmann damaged a 2nd Tempest, but then our guys realized this isn't a healthy situation with all these Brits flying around, so we broke off. So this was the dramatic ending to the War of Independence, that 5.5 British aircraft were shot down, or 5 aircraft shot down and 1 damaged on the last day of the fighting. Our people didn't know that they were Brits when they first came, thought they were Egyptians. The British were flying Spitfires, the Egyptians were flying, and we were flying Spitfires. We had our Spitfires painted with a red nose so that we would always identify the Israeli Spitfires. And here we have another sweet story. On the day after Aaron Remes called a meeting of staff officers to try and assess what the fallout is going to be. Here we're not at war with Britain. 5 aircraft have been shot down, another one damaged. What are the British likely to do? So the guys expressed their opinions, and the first guy who came out of the meeting was an American pilot from Miami, Danny Kravitz. And sitting in the office next to Geel Avier was a British pilot by the name of Maury Mann. So Kravitz comes out of the meeting and he's looking very serious. And Maury Mann says to him, "Danny, what in the hell is going to happen?" So he says, "If you promise me that you won't say a word to anyone, I'll tell you." He says, "I promise." He says, "The Air Force has just taken an operational decision to bomb London." So Maury Mann looks at him and he says, "Danny, I couldn't care less, boy. I come from Manchester." A beautiful story, that. I come from Manchester. Sveka, to give you a general picture, I mentioned that there were 4,800 mechanics who came from 58 countries. That in itself is really an amazing phenomenon. How these Jews felt the need to help their brethren in Israel at this time of crisis. I should mention, by the way, that there were several women who played a great role. For example, in the Air Force, they worked in radar, they worked in codes and ciphers, they worked in intelligence. My wife happened to be the first instructor in meteorology in the Air Force. And the biggest contribution that we had to give was the experience and the expertise that we had acquired in World War II. I suppose we can really thank the Almighty that we had this reserve of military resources available to the State of Israel during this critical period. I maintain, Zvika, that the declaration of the State of Israel and the War of Independence were the two highest points in 2,000 years of Jewish history. It was a history of oppression and injustice and suffering, and suddenly a State of Israel arises. We're attacked by 6 Arab countries, by Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Jordan and the Arab Army of Liberation. We did not have a single combat aircraft. We did not have a single anti-aircraft gun. We had no artillery. When you think that the French had supplied the Syrians and the Lebanese, the British had supplied the Iraqis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians, and Israel was absolutely left on its own. One really could ask a question. How is it possible that the two great democracies, the USA and Britain, allowed a newborn state which was born with the approval of the United Nations to be absolutely exposed to Arab hatred? And we really knew what was going to happen. On the 1st of May, Azam Pasha, who was Secretary General of the Arab League, said that if the Zionists dare to declare a state, we will unleash a destruction on them worse than Hitler and Genghis Khan did in the massacres. So the War of Independence was undoubtedly Israel's most fateful war. If we had lost that war, you and I wouldn't be talking today, Svika. It was the longest war, and it was the costliest war. 6,300 Israelis